Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about age appropriateness. And there's been a lot of contention and argumentation around this notion of whether or not the UCP proposed curriculum is age appropriate. Now, that depends what you mean by age appropriate. If we're looking at a developmental model of what kids can know and do by themselves, that is very different than what kids can know and do with the help of a supportive adult. So let me give you an example. If we're looking at a knowledge-based curriculum in the way that the UCP is proposing, then telling stories is an age-appropriate model of teaching history content. You tell the stories, kids learn the stories, they can tell you the stories back. Kids from a very young age, certainly by kindergarten and grade 1 and 2, are able to do that. Now, what does that mean in terms of their ability to make sense of that information? Well, that's where it becomes a little more tenuous. So if you are trying to figure out what kids can understand about chronology or about ideas of history, then that becomes a little more difficult to do in this knowledge-based approach. So we know from a very young age, as early as grade 1, so 6-year-olds, that kids are able to look at change over time and identify the rough chronology, not the distance in time and space, but they are able to, for example, determine with pretty good accuracy the oldest kind of car to a modern car by looking at the differences, by looking at things that they're seeing, the black and white photography as opposed to color photography, the complexity of cars, and how that's changed over time. So they are able to recognize and build those differences in. What they are much less capable of doing is weaving together events that formulate over a period of time. So this is one of the ways in which the curriculum proposed by the UCP is not very effectively age appropriate. The kids can learn about the Mongols, but they're not able to integrate that in a larger context of what did the rise of the Mongols in Central Asia and its impact on Europe and Central Asia and the Middle East have upon the historical development of the West. How did they lead to falling powers? How did they lead to the plague? How did they, these are concepts that kids aren't able to make the connections between, and won't be able to make the connections between until they're much older. The problem is what is the content being given and how does it apply to children and their lives? If you have this disparate history of people that doesn't show connections between them, either spatially at the same time or across time with themes that are occurring, kids aren't going to make sense of any of that content knowledge beyond being able to spit it back out or picture it when it's brought to their attention in books that they're reading. And much of that content knowledge will fade very quickly by time this model expects students to use it for skill development. Now, on the other hand, when we're looking at social studies and we're looking at a developmental model that was categorized and theorized by Lev Vygotsky, building off of Jean Piaget, his argument, he brought to the table this idea that you could take what kids are capable of knowing on their own and through what he called a zone of proximal development, That's between what they're capable of with parent or teacher support and what they're capable of their own. Um, Children can be raised up and do more complex thinking and more complex work. So you can think of the difference between a kid being at a wall and not being big enough to climb it. But the Vygotskian zone of proximal development model is one in which you have the parent or the adult reaching down and helping the kid climb up. So in this model, kids are capable of doing much more complicated thinking about content with the guidance of a skilled teacher. It's no longer about, delivering content as having the content, delivering some of it, but then asking kids to think more deeply about it. Now, within this model, you can take content knowledge, you can take skills, and wed them together in a way that gets kids thinking about the history that they're learning or the democratic values that they're learning in more complex and critical ways. What is really helpful for kids in this model is what was in the model that was initially proposed in 2016, which is this concept-based model. Now, one of the big critiques of the concept-based model was that there wasn't sufficient content outcomes built in, and I think that's a fair criticism. Um, but within this concept-based model is this notion that kids can learn more readily if you teach content through themes. And the reason for this is that it takes the cognitive burden off of kids to try to, piece together these disparate historical moments and rather looks at the themes of, fairness or the environment and how we deal with it in integrated ways across content areas and across time and space. And kids are able to much more readily understand and retain knowledge as a result of being able to see similarities across time and space. Finally, you have a historical model that was popularized decades ago and one that we still use to good effect, which is the expanding horizons model, which the current curriculum is currently built upon. And that's the notion that you start with what the kids know from a very insular and particular individual notion of who they are. This is because kids are very inner focused. They're focused on their lives and they're not thinking about others. And so slowly expanding this from the individual to the classroom community to the neighborhood and city community to Alberta, broadly Canada, the world. And so these are the ideas that you are taking when you are taking Alberta's program of studies into consideration. Now, the expanding horizons model does have its detractors, in part because what I think the expanding horizons model doesn't do very well is integrate learning across disciplines. It's really difficult to align those because how we think of the expanding horizons in each discipline is a little bit different. And we know for the 21st century, work is much more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, meaning that we're trying to solve the same problems, but from different directions with different disciplines that need to be integrated. The question of age appropriateness cannot be answered fully unless we have a clear idea of what our goals for education are. If our goals, as stated by the UCP government implicitly and explicitly through this curriculum, is we just want to give students information that they can, repeat back and use in understanding things later down the road, then this curriculum achieves that. But I don't believe that's what our kids need. What our kids need is something more complex. more rich. They do need deep, rich content knowledge. And that doesn't mean the expansive history of the world. They don't need to know that all in elementary. What they do need to have is rich content with rich questions that get them thinking deeply about the content they're learning. Help them speak to big ideas in the world, and with the help of a skilled teacher that can help them get there, and we have that in abundance in Alberta, be able to lift them up, do things with that content that is both meaningful and powerful in terms of their skill development. Then we have a really good curriculum that merges content, understanding, and skills together. This curriculum simply doesn't do that.